If holiday baking feels stressful or rushed every single year, this is your reminder that it doesn't have to be that way. I've learned a few simple habits that make baking feel peaceful and doable again, even with fresh milled flour, even with sourdough, and even with little kids around. So we're definitely not lowering our standards. It truly just comes down to being organized and prepared, and also realistic. So in today's video, I'm sharing some general tips, some sourdough baking tips, and mindset shifts that helped me slow down and actually enjoy the season again. And of course, I'll show you some of my absolute favorite things I like to bake throughout this festive month in my European home. One thing that I'm sure a lot of you can relate to is that it's much easier to be relaxed and easygoing during the holidays if you feel prepared, or at least somewhat prepared. I don't mean that you have everything planned perfectly, because that never happens, much less in December, but I'm talking about just being prepared enough to not feel scattered. So things always change anyway, kids get sick, plans shift and all that, but I find that if I do a little planning upfront, the whole month feels a lot calmer. So at the start of December, or honestly more like 1 or 2 weeks into it, kind of around this time, I like to sit down and think about the recipes I actually want to make. And I'm trying to be really realistic when I do that. I don't plan anything too fancy, and I try to keep a balance between the recipes I know well and I know will turn out well, and some fun experiments that can go either way. So definitely be mindful of that balance to avoid stress. And what that means for me is I just go through my own tested recipes, holiday recipe books, random notes on my phone, screenshots, reels that I saved on Instagram, and I pick just a handful of things that I want to have on my December menu and that I know will genuinely make me excited. And then to those experiments, I add my safe and traditional things I make every year. So like I said, I'm keeping a fine balance here. And the purpose isn't to create a strict schedule here, it's simply to avoid that moment when you finally have the energy to bake something, only to realize you're missing 1 or 2 crucial ingredients. We've all been there, and since I don't keep every possible baking ingredient in my pantry at all times, like shredded coconut for example, I want to make sure that if coconut crescent cookies are on my list this year, which by the way they are, then I actually have shredded coconut at home before I soften my butter, only to realize the cookies just won't happen. So planning a bit and having the ingredients ready is such a small thing, and it takes half an hour at most to map it out, but it removes so much friction. I still like to stay in my routine of having fresh bread on hand, regardless of the other things I'm baking. So as you can see here in the video, I usually bake bread in bulk, and I will make one 100% fresh milled sourdough loaf and one that's about 50% fresh milled. I mix them up at the same time, shape them at the same time, and I bake them together because I'm using my 2-pan method, which means that I cover them with another loaf pan when I bake them, and that kind of gives the same effect as the Dutch oven, just without preheating, and that way I can bake up to 4 at the same time actually, but I usually just do 2. I do find that the dough that's made with 100% fresh milled flour will ferment quicker, so I usually either make sure it's in the cooler spot than the other doughs if I plan to shape them at the same time, or I simply shape it a couple of hours earlier and then stash it in the fridge to slow it down a bit, and that way I can then bake everything at the same time. On the note of baking with fresh milled flour, I was on Instagram a bit more lately, just browsing for some baking inspiration from my favorite creators, and I noticed that the same thing is happening as with everything in the food space, I guess. So either people are baking absolutely everything with fresh milled flour, or they don't use it at all. And I don't get that, and I think it's pushing people away from trying to bake with it because they feel like they should be doing everything 100% fresh milled or not use it at all. And that's a daunting prospect, at least for me. It's the same as sourdough bread and yeasted bread. I guess it's the same as sourdough bread versus yeasted bread. I, for example, happily bake both, and as far as I know, not many people do that. Well, to be fair, I do bake almost 90% of everything with sourdough, just because I find it easier to incorporate into my rhythm in the season of life. But I don't understand why everything has to be black and white, because the sweet spot is usually somewhere on the spectrum, always. So with fresh milled flour, for example, I learned that I like to feed my starter with all-purpose flour just because I never quite know how much I'll need, and I think it has a milder aroma that way, because with fresh milled, the starter can get sour very quickly. I also learned that making bread is actually the hardest thing to do with fresh milled flour, and you'd think it would be the easiest, but really any kind of brioche dough or even things like tortillas or cookies, everything except bread is easier to adapt for fresh milled flour, in my experience. You're watching me make Swedish cardamom buns here from freshly milled flour, and that reminds me of probably the most helpful tip for holiday baking, and that is to bake in bulk. If there's one thing I really like about sourdough versus baking with yeast, in my opinion, it's bulk baking. So you can make a big batch of dough and then turn it into 2 or even 3 completely different bakes, all from the same base. So when you find a brioche dough you love, either that sourdough brioche or yeasted brioche, and it becomes your staple, something you know how to make well, it will work for 90 or even 95% of all the sweet things you'll ever feel inspired to bake. For example, later in this video, you'll see me make sourdough star bread and sourdough brioche dinner rolls from the same dough. So I made one batch of dough, shaped it into star bread the first day, and then used the rest for brioche dinner rolls the next day. As you can see, these cardamom buns you're watching right now are made from the same dough too. They're just from the separate batch. Because for sweet bakes, I like the flavor to be very mild, so not too sour. What I usually do is I start a double batch in the morning. A double batch tends to be enough for my family for now. Then I divide it in half when it finishes bulk fermentation. Then I shape one half into whatever I want to bake that day, and the other half waits in the fridge so I can make something else from it the next day. That way, the process is incredibly flexible and it's such an efficient way to bake, especially during the holidays, when you might find yourself wanting to bake something almost every single day. And that way you get your bowls dirty once, you do your stretch and folds once because you're making the dough in bulk, and then you can create multiple bakes without repeating the entire mixing and rising and folding process. So that's probably the first half of the reason why I prefer sourdough over yeasted dough for holiday baking. And the other half, as I've mentioned before, is that sourdough really gives you time. So if you need to run errands or something unexpected comes up, it usually doesn't matter with sourdough because 1 hour or even 2 will rarely make a difference. Now that we're almost finished with the cardamom buns, you can probably see that the shaping process is a bit more complicated. They are definitely a labor of love. And honestly, even though sourdough star bread you'll see in a minute looks more impressive, I actually find the star shape much easier to make than these cardamom buns. But still, they turn out so pretty. And if you're used to making cinnamon rolls throughout the year, cardamom buns feel like something special that maybe you only make for the holidays, something a little more novel. And again, they are made from the same dough as cinnamon rolls. It's the same brioche dough, and you can even use the same filling as you would normally use for cinnamon rolls, so only the shape is different. And that's one idea of adding variety to your holiday baking without changing your dough or your filling. And now I'm making fresh milled sourdough brioche dinner rolls. Like I said, those are made from the same batch of dough as the star bread, which you'll see in a minute. I would only say that if you go the route of making multiple things from one brioche dough, especially if brioche is new to you and you're used to bread dough, more or less, you do have to keep in mind that brioche needs a longer rising time than your bread dough, which is actually kind of nice because at the same time it's really hard to over ferment. There is a reason why I'm talking about sourdough brioche dough so much, because as you can see in this video, I'm using it for 3 completely different bakes and it's exactly the same dough. So if there's one dough you want to master apart from the bread dough, of course, I say go for sourdough brioche. Sometimes I do think it might make more sense to tweak the ratios depending on what I'm making. So I start thinking maybe I need to make it a bit more elastic for something that needs more elaborate shaping, like star bread, for example, or maybe make it slightly less sweet and less buttery, for example, dinner rolls. But in the end, convenience always wins for me. I love the ease of knowing one dough really well. I know how it behaves in winter, in summer. I know how long I can keep it in the fridge before it gets too sour, how quickly it ferments with all-purpose flour or with fresh milk flour. And all that knowledge just makes baking so much easier. And I'm thankful for that, especially during the holiday season. And honestly, in this day and age of browsing recipes and following step-by-step instructions online, I think the art of mastering one thing really well and then expanding that one thing into lots of variations is very underrated. So if you're new to anything, to fresh milk flour or sourdough, or even just bread baking in general, my biggest advice is that don't rush. You have all the time in the world. Baking is something you can do every day. Maybe you even have to do it every day. So there's really no deadline. There's always room to experiment. So take your time, learn one recipe really well, perfect it, and then instead of jumping to a brand new recipe, maybe stick with one and make it multiple times to truly understand it. And then you can go on and try something else. And even when I say something else, I often just mean that you can make that same dough and just put it in a different shape or style. So that way you can expand what you can bake from just a few core doughs that you have memorized and that you really know how to handle. And that's actually how I develop my own recipes. Most of them start with something I already know by heart, and then I just play with it. So if I want to create a sourdough focaccia recipe, I don't browse focaccia recipes and start from scratch. I usually take my, let's say, my favorite bread dough, maybe one that's a bit more hydrated, and then I adapt it. I add even more water, shorten the fermentation because of the higher hydration, shape it differently, and it becomes focaccia. And that's, I think, a much more intuitive way to bake. And in the long run, I think will serve you really well. So if you are eager to try a few new things this holiday season, I'll have the recipes I'm showing in this video linked down below. I'll link the fresh milk version as well as all-purpose version, so hopefully you can go with one that fits your baking style best. I'm working really hard to publish everything in time, but I definitely prefer being in the kitchen over sitting behind the computer uploading recipes, so sometimes I do get a little bit behind and hopefully everything will be there when the video goes live. While I'm making this fresh milled sourdough star bread, I just want to address another thing that I see people obsessing about online, and that is using different varieties of wheat or even different types of grain like kamut or spelt. And while it's definitely fun to experiment and see what kind of grain or wheat variety you prefer in certain recipes, you can actually use hard white wheat for everything you bake. I know it's a bit controversial, but this is actually what I do. And again, it's just one of those situations where convenience wins for me. Yes, you will get better results if you use soft white wheat for muffins or cookies or any type of dough or batter where you don't need it to rise and expand and be elastic. But in my experience, it doesn't make that much of a difference. And some people are very particular about which mixes they use for different types of bread and so on. But again, hard white wheat can be a great base for any recipe. So even muffins or pancakes, I've used it for all those things and they still come out delicious. And the great thing about it is that you only need to source it once. And then there's storage, which is, in my opinion, easier too. If you only stock one type, I like to go through it pretty quickly so it doesn't get infested with something. I just always have a bad feeling about storing grains for a really long time. Although I know you can do that, I know they last long, but I'm just always wondering if they're still completely fine to use. So I prefer to have only hard white wheat, and I buy it from a local farm near me and just use it for everything. So if you're intimidated by baking with fresh milk flour because you think you suddenly have to have a lot of different varieties of grains on hand to make different things, that's actually not a requirement at all. And for those of you who are not from the US and aren't familiar with the classification of hard white, soft white, hard red, soft red, and so on, In Europe, we have different classifications, and as far as I know, at least in my country, the protein content is what you need to look for when choosing the strain of wheat you want. So the higher the gluten content, the more appropriate it is for bread baking. And in my country, we simply call the types of wheat that are suitable for that the bread making wheats. So if you're sourcing wheat berries for the first time, there are two important pieces of information to look for. The first one is make sure the protein content is quite high, ideally higher than 11 or 12%. And second, if you want a milder flavor, which is still strong, but not that strong, you should look for a white wheat variety and not a red wheat variety, because red wheats do tend to have a stronger taste. And I can't not mention the last thing on my list as far as holiday baking advice goes, and that is to try not to be too hard on yourself. If at any point you feel like you won't be able to squeeze baking into your schedule, or if the day suddenly gets so busy, keep in mind that the whole purpose of the holidays is usually spending time with the people you love. So keep that priority in mind, and in some instances, maybe hop into a local bakery or place an order with a local sourdough micro bakery and get some freshly baked goods delivered to your home without needing to bake them yourself, because sometimes that really is the best option. Again, it's all about balance. I hope you found this video helpful, and please, if you have a holiday baking tip, and it can be very particular or very unusual, honestly, the more unusual the better, leave it in the comments below so we can all share and we can all have calm, relaxed holidays while still making sure we have some homemade baked goods available. Because there's really no better time to bake a lot. Click subscribe if you want to follow along and see more videos like this, and I hope to see you next Friday. Bye!